There is a move powerful men make that almost nobody notices while it is happening. That is why it works. It is not loud. It is not theatrical. It is not the kind of move weak men recognize, because weak men are trained to notice force only when it arrives with noise. They think power has to announce itself. They think control has to look aggressive. They think dominance has to enter the room like a threat. But the most dangerous moves in life rarely look dangerous in the beginning. They look quiet, they look patient, they look almost ordinary. And by the time people realize what is happening, the position has already changed. That was always the deeper genius in Machiavelli. Most people reduce him to cruelty because they are too shallow to understand strategy. They hear his name and think of manipulation, coldness, ruthlessness, treachery. But what made Machiavelli dangerous was not that he admired evil. It was that he understood human nature without illusions. He understood that men are not ruled by what they say they value, but by what they fear, what they need, what they perceive, and what they believe too late. That is where real power lives. Not in constant confrontation, in silent repositioning. The power move nobody notices until it is too late is this. The strong man stops fighting for recognition and starts controlling perception through restraint, timing, and consequence. He says less, he reveals less, he reacts less, and while everybody else is busy performing strength, he is quietly rearranging the game. That is why they miss it, because noisy people cannot detect power that does not beg to be seen. I saw this once in a workplace where two men were climbing toward the same seat of influence. One of them looked more impressive in every obvious way. He spoke sharply, took up air, defended his ideas aggressively, made sure everybody knew when he was right. The other was quieter. He rarely argued, rarely interrupted, rarely explained more than necessary. Most people assumed the loud one was stronger because he looked harder to challenge. But over the course of months, something changed. The quiet man started becoming the one decision-makers turned to in uncertainty. Why? Because while the loud man was trying to dominate the room, the quiet man was learning the room. He knew who was insecure, who needed credit, who panicked under pressure, who talked too much when nervous, who shifted loyalty with status. By the time conflict came, he did not need to overpower anyone. He already knew where the structure was weakest. That is the move, not attack, position. Machiavelli understood that most people judge by appearances first and only understand reality after results force them to. That is why weak men become obsessed with appearances, while strategic men become obsessed with outcomes. In the actions of all men, one judges by the result. Wikiquote. That line alone explains most of human hierarchy. The average man wants to look strong now. The dangerous man wants to become undeniable later. Those are completely different psychologies. One is addicted to immediate validation. The other is devoted to delayed control. And that devotion changes how he moves through the world. When insult comes, he does not rush. When challenged, he does not spill his whole mind. When resisted, he does not waste himself trying to correct every false perception. He watches. He waits. He lets people keep showing their structure. Because the moment you stop reacting to everything, people start revealing everything. That is one of the first things powerful men learn. The person who keeps arguing is often the person giving away the most information. The person who keeps explaining is often the person exposing where guilt still controls him. The person who keeps defending himself is often the person teaching the world exactly how to move him. But the man who remains measured becomes difficult to map. And what people cannot map, they start handling more carefully. That is where fear begins. Not with shouting, with unreadability. There is something deeply unsettling about a man who no longer reacts in the expected way. You insult him, and he does not collapse into anger. You test him, and he does not over-explain. You withdraw warmth, and he does not chase. You provoke tension, and he does not rush to fix it. At first, weak people mistake that for passivity. Then time passes. Patterns become clearer. Outcomes shift. Suddenly what looked passive starts looking strategic. That is always how it happens. First they misread the move. Then they feel its effect. Then they rename it. Then they fear it. This is why restraint is one of the most underrated forms of power in the modern world. Everybody is trained to react. React online. React emotionally. React socially. React immediately. The entire culture rewards premature expression, because premature expression is easy to exploit. The man who can be baited quickly can be managed quickly. The man who has to answer everything has no real center. His attention is public property. His nervous system belongs to the room. The strategic man refuses that theft. He understands that every reaction is a disclosure. Every unnecessary word is a clue. Every rushed defense reveals where your identity still depends on approval. So he begins cutting the leakage. Not because he is trying to be mysterious for effect, because he understands cost. It costs energy to explain yourself to people who are not seeking truth. It costs status to defend decisions that should have stood on their own. It costs leverage to show emotion before you understand the battlefield. It costs power to let lesser people choose your timing. That is why the Machiavellian move is so easy to miss. It does not feel dramatic in the moment. It feels like a man becoming quieter, cleaner, harder to rush, harder to bait, harder to read. And because the shift is internal before it becomes external, most people do not see it until their old methods stop working on him. That is when the fear begins. I remember a man in a family system that had taught him since childhood that every choice required explanation. If he changed plans, he explained. If he said no, he explained. If he needed space, he explained. If he was quiet, he explained that too. And because he explained everything, the family never updated their sense of him. They still treated him like someone whose life was open to emotional committee review. Then one year, something changed. Quietly. No dramatic speech. No declaration. He stopped arguing for every decision. Stopped packaging boundaries in apologies. Stopped making himself understandable to people committed to misunderstanding him anyway. At first, they called him distant. Then defensive. Then arrogant. What they were really feeling was the death of their leverage. They could no longer govern him through disappointment. And once that happened, the entire balance shifted. That is the move nobody notices until it is too late. You do not announce your change. You embody it. You stop giving people the version of you that was easy to manage. You stop helping them keep the old hierarchy alive. And because you do it without drama, they realize the truth only after their usual tools stop working. Machiavelli's brilliance was not in teaching men to be cruel for the sake of cruelty. It was in teaching that power belongs to the one who understands perception, timing, and necessity better than the crowd does. He understood that most people live emotionally, while a few men learn to live strategically. He understood that what people see is not always what matters most. And what matters most is often decided long before the crowd realizes a move was made. Spark notes. That is why the strongest man in the room is often not the one speaking hardest. It is the one gathering the most information while revealing the least of himself. Think about how this plays out in relationships. The average man feels a shift in energy and immediately starts talking. He wants clarification, reassurance, closure, immediate understanding. So he explains his feelings, his concerns, his intentions, his pain. He calls it honesty. Sometimes it is, but often it is also emotional impatience. He cannot bear uncertainty, so he floods the moment with language. In doing that, he gives away all his leverage. He tells the other person exactly how much the shift affected him, exactly where he is vulnerable, exactly how badly he wants resolution. The strategic man does something different. He notices the shift. Then he watches. Does the warmth return naturally, or only when access is threatened? Does the other person want connection, or just control over the emotional frame? Does distance reveal sincerity, or manipulation? He does not ignore reality. He studies it long enough to stop negotiating with illusion. That is strategic dominance. Not suppressing truth, refusing to rush past it. The same is true in work, friendship, status, loyalty, betrayal. Weak men keep stepping into premature conflict because they think power means visible resistance. Strong men understand that most real moves happen before the visible collision. By the time the collision arrives, the board has often already been prepared. That is why the loud man loses more than he knows. He keeps trying to win the scene. The dangerous man is trying to win the structure. One wants applause, the other wants irreversible advantage. And irreversible advantage is almost always built in silence. Quietly building competence while others build image. Quietly watching patterns while others broadcast confidence. Quietly withdrawing access while others assume nothing has changed. Quietly letting fools become careless because they think the game is still open. That is the part nobody sees. And because they do not see it, they do not defend against it. That is why it is too late when they finally understand. The person who underestimated you already exposed too much. The person who kept testing you already showed the pattern. The person who thought your silence was weakness already miscalculated the cost. The room that mistook your patience for passivity now has to deal with the fact that you were not standing still. You were repositioning. This is one of the hardest lessons for emotional men to accept. Not every truth needs to be said immediately. Not every challenge deserves direct confrontation. Not every enemy should be warned. Not every move should be visible. Sometimes the highest expression of power is letting events ripen until action becomes obvious, decisive, and almost impossible to answer. That is what most men call cold, because they do not understand it. But coldness is not the point. Clarity is. The dangerous man is not quiet because he feels nothing. He is quiet because he refuses to let feeling choose timing. That is mastery. And mastery is what weak people always notice too late, because weak people confuse emotional intensity with actual force. They think the man who cares less is stronger. Not necessarily. Often the stronger man cares deeply. He just cares more about outcome than expression. More about position than performance. More about control than immediate relief. That is why he is dangerous. He can delay gratification in conflict. He can tolerate being underestimated. He can survive being misunderstood for a season. He can let other people keep talking long enough to reveal where they are soft. He can let time become an ally instead of an enemy. Most people cannot do that. They need closure too quickly. Recognition too quickly. Revenge too quickly. And that appetite ruins them. It ruins them in arguments because they reveal too much. Ruins them in relationships because they chase certainty too early. Ruins them in business because they move before the structure is clear. Ruins them in status battles because they cannot bear the temporary pain of invisibility. The Machiavellian move is different. It says, let them think the game is simple. Let them believe your silence means nothing. Let them assume your patience is passivity. Let them grow comfortable. Let them speak too freely. Let them expose motive, insecurity, jealousy, overconfidence, and habit. Then move when the move changes the whole frame. That is why consequence is always stronger than argument. Argument tells people what you think. Consequence teaches them what reality is. A speech can be resisted. A shift in access cannot. A warning can be mocked. A structural loss cannot. A verbal victory can be forgotten. A changed position lingers in memory. This is why men who want real dominance must outgrow the addiction to being immediately understood. You do not need everyone to grasp your silence in real time. You do not need people to know your reasons before they feel your standards. You do not need to explain every strategic withdrawal, every delayed response, every measured answer, every refusal to engage. If the move is right, reality will explain it later. And that is far more powerful. The crowd usually learns last because the crowd lives on surface. Machiavelli wrote for the rare man willing to live below the surface. The man who understands that control is often invisible while it is being built. The man who knows that perception can be guided without being chased. The man who sees that the greatest advantage is often not in attacking harder, but in allowing other people to expose themselves to a man who is disciplined enough not to interrupt the reveal. That is what makes him feared later. Not brutality. Precision. The room starts noticing he no longer rushes, no longer explains, no longer reacts for free, no longer gives emotional access without reason, no longer argues where others are simply trying to pull him into noise. And because of that, something changes in the atmosphere around him. People choose their words more carefully. Tests become less casual. Disrespect becomes less reckless. The entire environment becomes more cautious around him. Not because he threatened anyone, but because they can feel there is finally cost attached to misreading him. That is what power looks like when it matures. Not louder, more final. So if you are looking for the power move nobody notices until it is too late, it is not some clever line, not a public takedown, not a theatrical display of coldness. It is the moment you stop leaking yourself into every battle and start becoming strategically unreadable. The moment you stop fighting for immediate understanding and start building quiet leverage. The moment you stop proving and start positioning. The moment you let silence gather information, let time expose patterns, and let consequence speak where argument once did. That is the move. And once a man truly learns it, the world never deals with him the same way again. Because now he is no longer available in the old way. No longer rushable. No longer baitable. No longer governable by small people with loud tactics. He has become one of the rare things the world always notices too late. A patient man with strategic control. And by the time they notice that, it is already too late.